how the people are doing. So, now this comparison. Let's face it, I'm sure we are all very excited about this one because there's just so much to unpack, right? We all already know that the Vivo X200 Ultra, it is incredible when it comes to cameras, but there are certain quirks and certain problematic situations that we can face, especially with this one, because Vivo decided to go for the 35mm main camera, which is around a 1.5x zoom as opposed to the regular main cameras, including the one in the Huawei that we usually see. Also, by the way, the Huawei has a 1-inch sensor on the main camera, this one does not, and we'll see how that plays out. Alongside that, the Huawei, obviously, it has this whole situation with the telephoto zoom, and honestly, I can't wait to dive in. But before anything else, I just want to bring a little attention to this. I know everyone's been asking me to compare the Huawei and also the Vivo to the Oppo Find X8 Ultra. I wish I could, believe me. Would love to try out the insane telephoto and periscope capabilities that Oppo has to offer, but bloody hell, it is impossible to properly buy anywhere near me. I have to import it from China, and that's a righteous pain in the ass. I'm just not willing to go through that. I did it once and it was just annoying as all hell combined. I really don't want to do it again. So, bearing that in mind, if Oppo were to, let's say, take notes from the Vivo X200 Ultra launch, this is the Chinese version that I have. But I bought this right here, just got it with 1-day shipping, and I think, free delivery as well. So, considering that, it's just, I don't want to deal with the crap of importing it all the way from China and waiting for delivery, so on and so forth. It's just too much hassle. If Oppo were to launch it like Vivo, then, hallelujah. But until then, no dice. So let's jump in. Now, of course, color profiles. This is something that is very interesting and has always been very nice on the X200 Ultra, as you might already know. We have the vivid colors, which works as you would expect. You get a good amount of vibrance, not too much, not too little. On the Huawei, however, the approach is kind of different. So what you're looking at right now, these are the original colors. This is what you can expect, and this is the mode that I would recommend that you use for a couple reasons, and we'll get to it. But of course, on the X200 Ultra, there is one color profile that I think works near flawlessly, especially if you're interested in really nice and natural colors. Will it be perfect 100% of the time? No, of course not. Nothing is. But will it get closer than just about any other flagship that I've personally used? Also yes, absolutely. And on the Huawei, we have something that's very interesting. It's called a vivid color profile. You might think that it's all about giving you more vibrance, but that's not really the case. What this does on the Huawei is that it gives you a whole lot of contrast, which is nice, but I do think it can go overboard a little bit. It's similar to textured mode that we have on the X200 Ultra. You'll see that as well in a moment. But at the end of the day, I think original colors on the Huawei and natural colors on the X200, these are the most consistent color profiles that you can have. And as promised, we of course have textured mode, and you can see it goes a little too crazy on the Vivo X200 Ultra. So this is why, even though yes, in a case like this where it's flat lighting, it can look kind of nice and kind of stylized even, I don't think it's worth using consistently because you don't have the consistency that you want. A lot of times you might just get completely crushed shadows, and that just doesn't look good. On the Huawei, you have a bright profile, which I don't like it. Some might want a low contrast color profile because that's exactly what this is. It gives you really brightened and low contrast shots that I don't want nothing to do with that. So yeah, I'm never going to use it, but if you want, well, there's an option for you. Now look, frankly speaking, with the main cameras, you're never going to have any real issues, especially if you're just shooting regular daylight stuff and so on. We have some issues, however, that can pop up with regards to just the approach that is being taken by the Vivo. So as you can probably tell, the Vivo uses 35mm, which is a 1.5x crop. And as nice as that can be and as distortion free as the images can be from Vivo, there are issues with regards to what your subject might be and how much space you have, more than anything else. I mean, this is case in point. There's no way for me to move any further back, so the only realistic option that I have is to use the ultrawide camera with a 2x sensor crop. Now, granted, the ultrawide camera on the Vivo is possibly one of the best ultrawides that we have. It has the same exact sensor as the main camera on the Vivo, so it is very good. However, when compared to the main cameras of really good flagships like the Huawei, well, you can run into issues with regards to detail. Now obviously, there's one thing to bear in mind, the Huawei does sharpen a lot. Despite that, I still think that it's just leagues ahead of the X200 Ultra because after all, you're using the ultrawide camera with a 2x sensor crop, and then here we are cropping into 500% on top of all of that just to check out details. Obviously, you won't be cropping into 500% on every single image you take with the ultrawide camera, but still, it really just goes to show the difference, doesn't it? Now of course, to keep things completely fair, here's a 35mm shot from both phones. Now, the Huawei doesn't really have a toggle for a 35mm mode or a 1.5x crop, so it's not really practical, but still, for the sake of fairness, we gotta compare the details. And see, this is precisely where you can see the sheer amount of oversharpening that can happen on the Huawei. We have 25 megapixels on the Huawei versus just 12 on the X200 Ultra. And yes, of course, it has the optical zoom advantage, but, well, the processing plays a huge role, especially when the difference in optical zoom is so little. Digital zoom can more than make up for it, but if the processing isn't able to maintain a good balance between sharpness and natural detail, well then things are just not going to turn out as nicely as you would hope. Now having said all of that, I do have one question for you. In terms of practicality, like yes, when you nitpick, certain images will have better detail preservation based on what kind of mode you use on either of these phones. But at the end of the day, when you take regular photos, are you willing to live with a 35mm mode? That's what I'm really curious about, because in this very situation, in a lot of these photos, as you can probably tell, a lot of shots benefit from a wider angle, which is why, it looks much more complete and properly framed on the Huawei. And of course, when I use 28mm mode on the X200 Ultra, but fact is, when I try to use the main camera, which again, that's the camera you really want to use more than anything else. That's the camera that's the most well optimized and it's going to give you the best possible results. Honestly, having the wider angle on the Huawei, at least in the photos that I took in this comparison specifically, I definitely felt like it was a lot more comfortable and a lot easier to frame shots the way I wanted them to be. So it really is something to think about. How often are you going to encounter situations where 35mm mode is just going to be way too tight? Now look, with regards to dynamic range, I sincerely doubt that either of these phones is ever going to give you grief, because after all, these are about as good as they can get with dynamic range specifically. Now in general, weirdly enough, I have noticed that the Huawei goes for a little bit more blown out approach with some of the highlights, especially when it's like really harshly backlit or something like that. May not be completely realistic, but we are testing the limits here. And I have also noticed that the colors can sometimes be not quite as nice, as you can probably tell here. Like, there's a full-blown green tint on the Huawei, which is being handled perfectly on the X200 Ultra, and the painting wasn't even that green. It was more bluish, which is exactly how it looks on the X200 Ultra. But then again, that was a one-off situation, and in this case, it's like basically perfect on both phones. I have nothing to complain about. Now look, when it comes to the ultrawide camera, I sincerely doubt that you're ever going to have any problems here, because in this case, the differences are that much lower. In case of the main camera, we obviously had quite a few things to take care of, but with the ultrawide, I think both are just going to perform plenty well. Now, there are certain things, certain niche situations where you might face issues. One of the things to bear in mind is that the X200 Ultra doesn't sharpen as much as the Huawei, as you would expect, but it also has more detail because it's possibly one of the best ultrawide sensors that we have. And another thing, I'm sure you've noticed this already, but with the colors, there's something awkward going on, because a lot of times, especially when I took some of these indoor shots where we had some warm lighting but not too much, the Huawei just went crazy, like it went near nuclear with the warmth. Now this image right here, I think is the perfect representation of the problems that we have on the Huawei's ultrawide, especially with regards to colors. Like yes, dynamic range, I would say the highlight preservation not quite as good, but we are getting slightly more detail in the shadows as opposed to the X200 Ultra. Not a huge difference, but I'm okay to live with the fact that it's blowing out some highlights. I don't prefer it, but well, it's fine. However, the colors, what in the hell? Like, first and foremost, the yellows, way too saturated and it just looks unnatural and weird. And then just take a look at the shadows. There's blue all over the place. There's magenta on the wall, there's blue in the shadows, and it makes no sense as to why so much color is being injected into the shot. Honestly, I think that the Huawei was doing a much better job with colors with the main camera, so I'm not really sure why it's struggling so much here. Now then, of course, for macro, I think it's very obvious that we love our telephoto macros here, and more than anything else, notice the difference in depth of field. This showcases that the sensor size, literally the size of the sensor, is way bigger on the Huawei as opposed to the X200 Ultra. It can also somehow get closer to the subject, which is incredible to say the least. Now, colors, obviously, without question, it's much more natural on the X200 Ultra. But then both phones also offer the option to do a 10x digital crop. Now, on the X200 Ultra, I know that it does a 7.4x 2x sensor crop and then a digital zoom after that to get to 10x. With regards to the Huawei, I cannot tell you whether or not it does a sensor crop, but what I can tell you is that the detail preservation is top tier. It's basically as good as the X200 Ultra, but with more depth of field. That's how the Huawei's image looks. Yes, you are getting a little bit closer once again, and it's a beautiful shot on both, to be completely fair, but the Huawei is definitely nudging it out, which is a first, by the way. I think this is the very first time that the Vivo has decidedly lost in terms of macro. It's a day worth celebrating. Now, moving right along, of course, we have zoom, and I'm sure this is the part of the video that most of us are the most interested in, for a very simple reason, which we'll get to. But before that, 2x sensor crop. I'm not a big fan of how either of these look, because they both look overprocessed. The Huawei is more sharpened as opposed to the Vivo, but the Vivo has these weird artifacts and more haloing somehow without as much sharpening, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But whatever the case, maybe it's because the Huawei also has noise reduction and more smoothing happening alongside that. So at the end of the day, not a huge fan of either of these. They're taking different approaches, but I would not say either of these is decidedly better than the other. But then, of course, 3.7x. Now, this is where things are going to be very interesting, because so far, I think the Vivo X200 Ultra, at least among the phones I've used, it has had the best 3.7x telephoto. The Huawei, as we saw previously, it has a larger sensor. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Huawei's 3.7x telephoto sensor is as big as the main camera on the Vivo. Let that sink in. That's how impressive it is. So I have high hopes. And those hopes are instantly crushed, because the Huawei cannot help but over-sharpen. Now, the X200 Ultra, it definitely has, slightly less detail as opposed to the Huawei, but man, the sharpening just takes all the beauty out of the image. It looks so amateur. Like, why? You have good hardware. Rely on that. A little bit more maybe. Like, dial the sharpening down to 50%. That's all you need to do. I'm sure an update can fix that. Just like 90% sure an update could fix this weird issue. It just, man, it's such underutilization of good hardware, But then what about 10x? And yes, this is where things get very interesting, because what happens on the Huawei is that it basically uses a combination of a sensor crop and optical zoom. The way it works is basically we are using the same sensor as we previously saw with the 3.7x, but the prism, it literally moves to a different lens structure that allows for a 9.4x. But then, at least as far as comments go and as far as I've done a little bit of research on my end as well, apparently it also has a bit of a sensor crop happening because of the way, optics work. And, well, it definitely does a really good job in terms of detail preservation. The Vivo, on the other hand, goddamn motion blur. I had a feeling this was gonna happen. I had such a good feeling that I took a second shot. And you guessed it, this is also at 10x. Now, the Vivo, obviously, it's a very good telephoto, yes, but can it handle itself against the hybrid optical sensor crop version of the zoom that we have on the Huawei? I don't really know how to term it properly now, because there's apparently the sensor crop involved as well. And let's just say it's really good. I expected it to be much worse. In a way, I think it's better on the X200 Ultra, don't you think? Like this, it looks more detailed on the X200 Ultra. It looks like we have less processing on the X200 Ultra. And also, just so you know, the colors are way more accurate on the X200 Ultra. The gray that you see is the accurate representation as opposed to the blue, which once again, we have blue here as well, just like we saw with the ultrawide camera. So not exactly a good thing, but overall, the details are surprisingly good on the X200 Ultra. Processed, for sure, but way better than I expected. It just really goes to show that old adage is always going to be true. No matter how good your hardware gets, if your software is not able to play along in tandem you're never gonna get the results that you want. But with that said, now let us check out high resolution. And yes, I painstakingly moved back and forth so many times just so I could line up the 35mm shot from the X200 Ultra with the 24mm high-res on the Huawei. Now cropping all the way in, I think actually the Huawei is doing a much better job. So just like we saw, there is some amount of sharpening on the Huawei, but perhaps because it's using high-res, the sharpening doesn't affect the overall quality nearly as much. I think it adds to the overall detail preservation. Could they lower it a little bit and still have really good detail preservation? Yes. Would it look more natural? Also yes. But given the results we saw, this is a lot better. Now then, of course, we have the ultra-wide camera, and this is like the perfect opportunity for the Vivo's really high quality ultra-wide to really shine through. And it does. Most definitely it does. Initially, you might not notice a whole lot of difference, but just look closer. Look at all the various patterns and the inscriptions and so on and so forth that's happening. The small fine details and textures. They are so much better preserved on the Vivo as opposed to anything we're getting on the Huawei. Now yes, once again, is there a point in the ultra-wide camera being slightly better? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, if you're really interested in high-res shots and you need the detail preservation, then the X200 Ultra is possibly the best one out there. The Huawei, it's close, but it's definitely lagging behind in that department. And now, of course, the 3.7x, and just once again, take a look at the difference in depth of field. It really goes to show how big that sensor is on the Huawei. I do hope that Vivo updates it and gives us this sensor quality. It would be, honestly, with their processing, it would blow the entire competition out the water. There's no two ways about it. However, let's zoom in. And man, being completely honest, the Huawei is definitely pulling ahead this time around. I was surprised to see just how well the Vivo kept up in 12-megapixel shots, but at high resolution, without question, the Huawei is the way to go. I mean, look at it. This is how shots are supposed to look. Not sharpened, but naturally detailed. What about 200? So now at 200, I do think the sharpening goes down a fair bit. It looks a lot nicer as opposed to the previous shots. It is bringing out a little bit more detail as opposed to the Huawei, but I still think it's just way too overprocessed. At least for my personal taste, I'm still gonna pick the Huawei. So in a way, regular zoom shots look pretty much either identical or better on the X200 Ultra. At least for my books, they look better because of the sheer over sharpening we get from Huawei. But then with high res, it's actually giving us consistently better results on the Huawei. So let's back and forth on this one. So yeah, I think the tiebreaker is going to be night mode, which is where things get very interesting. So as usual, we do have our color profiles. And yes, in case you're wondering, the colors do switch from purple to red in the scene itself. The lights are changing. So just, bear that in mind. It's not like the color profiles are making that kind of insane switch. That's not really what's happening. The differences are actually much more minor when it comes to night mode. Simply put, I would easily recommend going for Zeiss natural colors on the Vivo, and once again, original on the Huawei. Those are going to give you the most consistent and the best results in most situations. If you want darker shadows, more contrast, then the textured mode on the X200 Ultra and the vivid mode on the Huawei might be good secondary options, but again, consistency wise, my recommendations are basically the same as they were before. Now speaking of consistency, the colors, they look nice on the Huawei, and I said this in the previous comparison with the Xiaomi 15 Ultra as well. I think the colors at night, especially when you have a lot of colors like in these situations, it looks good. Without question, it looks really nice and really vibrant, really catchy, really punchy on the Huawei. So yes, by all means, it will depend on personal preference. I have no doubts about that. But of course, we still have that same old issue when it comes to 35mm on the Vivo. This shot particularly, I could not have gotten this unless I laid down on the ground and tried to take it with 35mm. So I had to use 28mm, which, as you know, is not going to give you nearly as much detail. And it's a very similar situation here, but the reason I took this is so that we can actually test out the details. So let's crop in. And well, to be completely honest, it's not bad on the Vivo, but the overall details and natural sharpness, the realistic sharp, not the over sharpening, not the processing, the natural sharpness in the details is just so much nicer on the Huawei for obvious optical reasons. It really goes to show that there's just situations where the Vivo is gonna suffer because of the choice that Vivo made when it comes to the 35mm mode. Now speaking of course, we have to check out the detail preservation at 35mm mode against the Huawei. Now, in this case, I'm not zooming in with the Huawei. I just want to see main camera to main camera what difference is. I tried to frame this as perfectly as possible. And cropping all the way in, I would say, just as expected, the Huawei just looks a little too over-sharpened and over-processed. If Huawei is able to fix that, which I sincerely hope they do, then I would say that it would be very, very close, if not basically the same in terms of detail preservation as the Vivo, which is a very, very good thing. But for now at least, I'm not a huge fan of the detail preservation, and the way it approaches detail preservation is the issue that I have here. But of course, Vivo has a very neat trick up its sleeve. We can use high resolution with night mode. If that prospect sounds insane to you, well, that's because it is. It is insanely good. That's the best way to put it, because man, the sheer level of detail that you can preserve is quite something. I didn't even bother trying to frame this up all that well because, well, who cares? I know for a fact that the 50 megapixel mode is just gonna skyrocket the details and the Huawei is not gonna be able to keep up. Case in point. But then when it comes to the ultra-wide camera, and see, it's very obvious once again. The colors, they look nice on the Huawei, but the natural, very realistic look that we get from Vivo with its natural colors, it's second to none. It just immediately appeals to me so much more. May not be the case for you. You may just look at it and be like, well, that's just bland. It could be, nothing wrong with that. For you, then obviously the Huawei is the way to go, or maybe use a different color profile on the Vivo. But honestly, I know for a fact that there are a lot of people out there who appreciate natural colors, and there's literally nothing else out there like the Vivo for that specific purpose. But of course, just as you would have imagined, we also get high resolution with the really high quality ultra-wide sensor on the Vivo. And yes, in case you're wondering, it definitely translates when it comes to detail preservation. Having that high quality sensor and high res with night mode, those really good night mode processing that we get on Vivo, it's really something else, and the Huawei really can't keep up at this point. But now of course we are finishing off with zoom. So first and foremost we have the 2x sensor crop, and once again, just look at the colors. It's crazy how much warmth there is on the Huawei, especially when there wasn't any at all in the scene. Well, there was a little bit of warm light as we can see on the Vivo, but not nearly as much. And well, unsurprisingly, we are getting more detail preservation on the Vivo X200 Ultra. On Vivo, it's not a 2x sensor crop. It's a crop from 35mm, which is 1.5x, to 50mm, which is 2x. So technically, it's not a 2x crop at all. So naturally, you get a lot better detail preservation, especially at night. And then of course, the 3.7x on both of these. As you know already, we get high resolution. And yes, in case you're wondering, we do get high resolution on the 3.7x as well. All of the high resolution as we saw previously. But first, let's just set the bar with 12 megapixels. And I would say at night, the processing is definitely much better on the Vivo because we are getting far better quality overall. And I feel like you can see it even after YouTube compression, but there's this weird amount of aliasing and artifacting all over the place with the Huawei. And then we have 50 megapixels, which showed up blurry on the X200 Ultra. Man, motion blur sometimes, it creeps up on you when you're not looking, and then just sucker punches you in the nether region. Just, God, it is so annoying when that happens. Unfortunate, really, because, well, however, 200 megapixels, that somehow came out perfectly, and honestly, I'm not that impressed. Like, the 12 pixel shot already looked nice, and the 200 megapixels is not really adding much, and I doubt the 50 megapixels would have added anything at all at this point. So yes, maybe there's a little bit more slight amount of natural detail higher on the Vivo, but at least in this case, it's not really doing anything special for it. But then of course we get that prism zoom on the Huawei with 10x. I think that's the best name I can come up for it. And so cropping all the way in, I think it doesn't surprise any of us that the Huawei is going to do a slightly better job. It's not as good as I would have hoped for it to be, but it is better. In comparison to the Vivo, it is definitely doing a better job. I wish that they would fine-tune the processing. That's where the Huawei is really lagging at this point. And so that brings us to the end of this comparison. Now, I have to admit, it's very obvious that the Huawei has tremendous hardware and a lot of potential, but the processing is just not mature enough to hold it at the spot where it deserves to be. The Vivo, on the other hand, this is like the perfect example. It has fairly good hardware, definitely lagging in terms of the main camera. I mean, it's not a one-inch sensor. In this day and age, if you're a camera-centric device like the Vivo X200 Ultra, an Ultra device on top, it needs a one-inch sensor. But outside of that, I definitely think that because Vivo's processing is so fine-tuned, it just takes over in a lot of situations. Case in point, when you're trying to zoom in at 12 pixels with the Huawei, it's supposed to have the optical advantage, but it's losing out because the processing is not able to give you the right amount of sharpness and hold back the sharpness enough. But then high resolution, it does tremendously well, like almost immediately better as opposed to the Vivo. So there is the possibility of much better results, but it's just the processing isn't fine-tuned enough. That's the best way to put it. So with that in mind, I do think that if Huawei were to give us some really nice juicy updates that fixes these few issues, well, bloody hell, that's gonna be incredible. Anywho, with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll have the human subjects comparisons out soon enough. I know some people might be asking already. It's already been shot, like the photos have been shot. I'm gonna finish it off. I'm gonna have it around this week time. So, let's see you then. Cheers.